Welcome back to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm Sher. In part two of our conversation with Dr. Mohamed Abdou, we turn to the concept of Taghūt, a Quranic framework for understanding idolatry, empire, and the spiritual foundations of war. From 1492 to Gaza, from Columbus to the House of Saud, Dr. Abdou traces how domination is justified through theology, architecture, and state violence. We talk about martyrdom as memory, tunnels as sanctuaries of life, and the urgent need to build abolitionist forms of Islam rooted in the land, not the state. We explore Foucault's reading of the Iranian Revolution, the betrayal of spiritual insurgency by both liberals and leftists, and what it means to live beyond the world of the above. This is not a politics of spectacle, it's an ethics of sacrifice, refusal, and revolutionary taqwā. Like, share, and subscribe. Support the project at buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network to help us keep doing this work.
So across your work, Taghūt emerges
Yes.
as a key concept for understanding Zionism and U.S. empire. How does this Quranic anti-idolatrous insurgent concept clarify the theological stakes of war?
Thank you. Well, look, in 1492, several things happened. Right? So Muslims and Jews in Spain were referred to as savages and heathens, savage being the racial, heathen being the religious identifier. We were forcibly converted, we were murdered, we were persecuted, pillaged. And Ferdinand and Isabel, well, Columbus, who's a crusader, went to Ferdinand and Isabel because he had his eyes in Jerusalem. Remember, he grew in an environment in which he saw the loss of Jerusalem to Muslims, and he believed that the end times were going to happen within his lifetime, and he wanted to gather riches. So he convinced Ferdinand and Isabel that he would gather riches in order to fund the crusade and the reconquest of Jerusalem. Of course, he relied. Well, I'm not going to get into that, but he relied basically on Muslim astronomers and geographers, but he miscalculated his journey, particularly al-Biruni's work, and al-Farabi, actually. And anyways, he ended up reaching the shores of the Caribbean. The moment that he met the Taino people, he referred to them as savages and heathens, right? He described them as savages and heathens. Of course, you see the mimicry of this with Hernan Cortez, the conquistador, Spanish conquistador, who referred to Aztec temples as Moorish mosques, Aztec women as Moorish women, Aztec weapons that were being used as scimitars, which is the Spanish name, as alfanjis, which is the English term for them is scimitars. They're the weapons that Muslims used against the Crusaders. It's sort of like the curved sword that usually has Quranic verses etched on it. Right. He even referred to two-spirit people who are gender non-conforming Muslims as birdah, which is this term that was cast onto gender non-conforming Muslims. Of course, that project then, after you engage in the annihilation of over 100 million indigenous people across the continent, then you engaged in slavery, or the white supremacy and the white enlightenment project, if you will, engaged in slavery, and a third and fifth of the transatlantic slaves were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula on the west coast of Africa. What does Taghūt have to do with all this? Well, Taghūt is actually a spiritual and an ethical political orientation, just as much as Iman or believing is a spiritual ethical orientation in a different way. The orientation of Taghūt is towards the world of the above. I described the world in 1492. Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages. It was beginning to set up plantation economies, slavery economies. Its capitalism was beginning to thrive. The nation state was beginning to be built. This is what led ultimately to Sykes-Picot and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the splintering of predominantly Arab and Muslim societies, right? And the beginning and the full exacerbated sort of implementation of a Taghuti world, a world completely of the above. Now, I'm not saying that 1,445 years of Muslim history isn't filled with Taghuti mentality and Taghuti acts. Of course, Muslims committed a lot of problems, and it's because Muslims had left the original Ummah and what the Prophet ﷺ instilled and what the original polity instilled, the original Sahaba had instilled, that gradually Muslims started to buy into the world of the above. They started to become empires, right? Now, and injustices were committed. But still, during the medieval or pre-modern period, you can travel. There weren't nation states. There wasn't capitalism. I mean, there were certain dimensions that were different. Was there slavery? Yeah, but it's not the same thing as transatlantic slavery. Slaves weren't fundamental. You don't have plantation economies within so-called the Muslim empire and so on and so forth. So you don't own the slave. All these different manifestations. So we talk about, cross-comparative histories, literature's words. This becomes very important, right? Because some anarchists will say, oh, well, Muhammad doesn't condemn enough, slavery in medieval Muslim societies, and they're no different than transatlantic slavery. It's just like, yeah, because they're not the same. That doesn't mean that I'm not condoning slavery within itself, but you can't compare slavery that white supremacists engaged in with slavery that existed during these times, whether it's within Jewish societies, Muslim societies, et cetera, and the majority of slaves were not actually people of color; they were Circassian. There's a lot of detail there, and slaves could start their own works or businesses. They weren't owned; they could get married. They had a choice. They had upward mobility within society. So it's a very different world than the one that we know today. And again, this is not to condone slavery or modern forms of slavery in the Emirates and indentured servitude and labor, et cetera, right? That exists, migrant slavery and so on. So Taghūt manifests in that world of the above when you think about, even in terms of architecture. Look at the mile-high clock tower that exists in Saudi Arabia that overshadows the Kaaba. It's the House of Saud. I mean, this is the irony that peninsula is called the Arabian Peninsula. It's called the Saudis Peninsula because it's named after the royal family now, right? But it's Arabia, right?
Yeah.
So it's the world of the above, even in terms of architecture. It's just the Prophet, peace be upon him, described that one of the signs of the end times is people are building skyscrapers into the sky. Desert nomads are leaving their desert ways and building skyscrapers into the sky as if they're going to reach God, pierce the sky, dethrone God, and crown themselves as demagogues in a certain way, right? So that's the arrogance. That's the Taghūt. And of course, the Emiratis and the Saudis, they conscript scholars from societies like Egypt, from Al-Azhar, from South Asia, from America, people like Hamza Youssef and so on and so forth, Charmaine Jackson, etc., who are on their council of elders in order to justify the Abraham Accords and normalizations, because the normalization of the Abraham Accords wasn't just a matter of normalization between countries in the region or states in the region and the Zionist entity and the crusading entity. Rather, it was the death knell of the spiritual, ethical, political moorings of peoples within the region. And this is what made it so dangerous. So this is the Taghūt. The Taghūt is that exists in ISIS, that exists in Daesh. Because let me say this. This goes back to your previous question in terms of liberalism, words and their meaning. When you ask any Arab or Muslim, what is the word for state? What is the term that they'll say? They'll say dawla. But dawla, we know, and as you know that I write, does not mean state. Dawla or Duwayla actually is the proper pronunciation, is a term or a concept in the Quran whose roots lie between two verbs, zal and dar, to rotate and to go away. But we didn't have a word for state. So when we were conquered, during the time of Sykes-Picot, etc., we took a word that means the opposite of its intended meaning in the Quran, and we started using it for state. So the colonization of language, that's also a form of Taghūt, right? Whether it's those who would like to establish a so-called Islamic state as sort of a jumping point or launch pad towards the Ummah, or those who disagree with the idea that one should have an Ummah. And again, it's understandable because there have only been totalitarian understandings of the Ummah, fascistic understandings of the Ummah, but that's not the original meaning or the original foundation of the Ummah itself. So it's the fear of confronting the internalized Islamophobia from digging deeper. Sovereignty lies within the Ummah, beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Its manifestation on earth is in the Ummah. So how can we have an Ummah of believers, and an Ummah of believers that also includes nations and tribes of non-human life that we're in symbiotic relationship with? So all these questions again require a project, and they require people that are willing to relearn Islam. This is also my critique, I guess. I love Ali Shariati. We have a lot of Muslim leftists, historically speaking, but the problem with that trajectory is that it still normalized the state. A lot of Muslim Marxists still normalize the state, and they don't want to contend with the Taghūt that has to deal with an analysis of power, of how political power functions. That's why we refer to it as political economy. That's why historical materialism is also limited, because it doesn't include the element of spirituality, it doesn't include the element of an understanding of power, an analysis of power or political power, that we all covet power on some level. So, that's and Taghūti mentality that way, deification that way.
In Communique number 3, you invoke the assassinations of our sons. How do target killings, martyrdom, and collective remembrance form part of the Gaza's theology of steadfastness and revolutionary continuity?
Well, our martyrs are names, they are lives, they are universes, they are worlds. How do we honor? I mean, the same thing with, say, forgive me, I'm going to evoke this not just in Gaza, but the Black Spring. What, there are no George Floyd's, Trayvon Martin's, Michael Brown's, Breonna Taylor's now, the Hind Rajabs, the Wadiya Al-Fayyoums, who was killed in Illinois, stabbed, over 18 times, or between 12 to 18 times, by his neighbor, his white neighbor that used to play with him and make him toys, swing. Right? And then Gaza happens, and then, he goes and kills Wadiya. Sorry, not Fadi, Wadiya Al-Fayyoum. Hind Rajab, over close to 300 bullets, as she's crying out for emergency workers and crying for her family to help save her. The element of mass information, the AI world. How do we remember our martyrs? Because again, our martyrs don't die, and they are witnesses now upon us. That requires a whole different level of responsibility on our part, and the interlinking in not whitewashed ways our struggles. And that's what's key right now is, if we're serious about Palestine's liberation and we're in Turtle Island, we have to center indigenous people. We have to center indigenous sovereignty. We have to center Black self-determination. We can't say free Palestine while not dealing with Turtle Island. Everybody has to hyphenate their identities. The African American, the Asian American, the Black American, the Arab American, the every American, the Indian American, yet who's the one that doesn't have to hyphenate their name? It's the white man, because they're assumed to be the native of the land. So the lack of taking indigenous struggles seriously, and if we're serious about, we have to face the bigger monster in the mirror. If we're serious about honoring our martyrs, we have to contend with the martyrs because of the ongoing genocide of indigenous and Black people. What, indigenous people don't have the absence of clean water, their suicide rates, their incarceration rates, same with our Black siblings. So this is the irony behind that, but we don't want to deal, because it's easy to point at a monster far away, because that doesn't force us to deal with, again, the monster staring us in the mirror. The only way to honor, again, Gaza is to really deal with the monsters, the Taghūts that we have inside, is to give everything that we have, as our people in Palestine are sacrificing everything. They have given everything. There's nothing that they haven't. They have given their children, their belongings, their homes, and still they remain resilient. What have we given up? Oh, I got doxxed. Oh, okay. That's not a big of a sacrifice. That's the least one can do. That's nothing, actually. That's nothing. Okay, I lost my source of income. Alhamdulillah, I'm fine. So pushing that emblem, the greater jihad. What can I give more? What can I sacrifice more? What can I do more? Be it, again, and there are many forms of jihad, as we noted, be it in terms of knowledge, be it in terms of, because knowledge is just a form of propaganda. Whatever it may be, but we have to start going beyond the minutiae of the petty sacrifices or things that are given up, the trivial things in the name of sacrifice, in the name of getting an extra follower on Twitter or on Facebook or on Instagram or on social media. We need to be able to give our lives. This is a battle of the dunya versus the akhirah, the life, the temporary life versus the real world. And this is why Allah describes the dunya and this world as shahwun wa mata'. It's filled with pleasures, yes. It's filled with beautiful ornaments, yes, of which are children, of which is wealth. But these are part of the seductions in life. And this is a test. Either you are seduced by Taghūt and the seductions of life, or you know what this world is actually about. And this is where we look to our mujahideen and our people in Gaza. That's the only way we honor them.
Yeah. Returning to the question of Iran, you spoke a little bit about how this is a critical moment in sort of shifting and possibly shifting towards an Islam from below. But I wanted to get your perspective on Foucault's analysis from 1979, Iranian revolution as a form of spiritual political insurrection, and how that was critiqued by both liberal and left scholars, right, at the time. And seeing your perspective in terms of that, does your critique of Taghūt and the embrace of Islam of the below complicate or extend Foucault's reading?
I think it definitely extends while dealing with his Orientalism at the same time.
Yeah.
What you refer to as political spirituality, which is really, again, Malcolm's project, right? I mean, again, any idea is inherently political. This is the irony behind the term Islamist. That's such an Orientalist term, right?
Yeah.
Political Islam. That's what Judaism is not political. Christianity is not political. Like any idea is political. Hinduism is any idea is political. right? The question is, what sort of ethical, political, spiritual praxis or responsibilities is it anchored in? That becomes the question. So I'm out to deal with this question of political spirituality. And of course, liberals and progressives that have critiqued Foucault are critiquing him on the one hand that he's not critical enough of Iran, which is valid, but are also critical of him because he actually values something in Islam and its revolutionary potential. And that's what he's tapping into. It's just that Foucault is not a Muslim, and it's not his project to develop a Quran of the oppressed, our Quran of the resistance. That's left as somebody like me, because you have to develop that from a theological perspective, right? This is why I even deal with the Quran explicitly so. Right? This is not to say that I ignore the Sunnah or Shiite or oral traditions, or that I don't value Sufism or Ismaili. I center the Quran because whether you're a nation of Islam or any of the 73-something denominations of Islam, the Quran is the one book that you are beholden to as an Ahmadi, as an Ismaili, as whatever. So my judgment of you, this is why I don't even call myself a Sunni Muslim. I was taught the Quran by a Shiite Muslim who was over 100 years old. His name was Sheikh Jilani. And I didn't even know he was a Shiite up until he passed away during my first year of engineering. My point being is that I don't identify with a particular sect because my barometer, my engagement with regards to myself, my measuring yardstick with regards to others, as well as myself, is the Quran, right?
Yeah.
And again, things have to be started with a particular foundation. When Prophet ﷺ was conveying the message, he spent 10 years working on Aqidat al-Tawheed, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Why? Because if you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you don't deify a nation, you don't deify a state, you don't worship your mother, your father, you don't worship your children, you don't worship wealth, you don't worship. So 10 years to institute that. And then after that, the forbiddance of drinking. And then after that, debates about this or that. These, I'm not trying to take away from the branches of the tree, but where's the trunk? So this is what becomes, we've left the trunk, the social justice pillars, right? Muslims were committing femicide. So you know, the transformation, the trunk of the tree needs to be there. Arabs were committing femicide during because that was part of their culture. They would bury their women alive. The trunk of the tree needs to be there. To get entangled in the hijab, the not hijab, these are, again, I'm not trying to make light of these debates, but there's disciplinary debates. These are the branches of the tree. That's not the trunk. Because you could be wearing a hijab and engaged in haya. You could not be wearing a hijab and be engaged in haya too, and modesty, and men need to engage in modesty too. So what are we talking about here, right? When we talk about issues of sexuality, then we need to talk about and same-sex practicing. This is why I don't buy into LGBTIQ categories. Those are Western imperatives, and that's homo-nationalism and the weaponization of sexuality as an identity politics. Who says that anybody should know what a person does in their bedroom? There's an element of khususiyat or privacy, right? Versus umumiyat, right? But look at the kind of pedantic debates that we're engaged in, that are decontextualized from history, that are unmoored from the foundations of Islam. So again, going back to the Foucault question, political spirituality is fundamental because any idea, what, Marxism is not a religion? It has become a religion. Anarchism has become a religion. Any idea is endowed with spirit. How else is it supposed to garner believers, let alone people ready to die for that idea? So he was onto something, and there will be, and there is no force in the world more powerful than religion, or than faith, or that spirituality. There is none. Because it's an idea that rests on a higher power, a higher cosmology of life, that I'm willing to die, not for Marx, but for the land or some creator. That kind of a manifestation, regardless of what we call creator, the Islam acknowledges over 200 to 300,000 different prophets that were sent to different tribes and nations. Created you from different types and nations so you may get to know one another. And the best amongst you is what? Those who exercise taqwā, piety. What is piety anchored in? Spiritual, ethical, political commitments. So this is where, again, give me Moses who stood before Pharaoh. Give me the Judaism of Moses that stood before Pharaoh. Give me Isa who stood in defense of Mary Magdalene, who flipped the money inside the temple while priests were engaging in riba, engaging in interest, which is an exploitation of the poor. Give me Muhammad who stood for the oppressed. You know, we all know Islam is anti-capitalist unless you're Erdogan and think that Islam is compatible with capitalism. But where is the forbiddance of riba? It's the foundation to capitalism, right? And without riba, then capitalism falls. So there are many different factors. What about the idea of khulafa? We're all caretakers. Why do you need a single khalifa? You have the idea of shura, which is community consensus, maslaha, public welfare, ijma', community consensus, shura is mutual consultation, sorry. So look at all these non-authoritarian commitments, not just anti-authoritarian, because if I say I'm anti-capitalist, okay, what are the non-capitalist principles? What are the non-authoritarian versus anti-authoritarianism is polemic, anti-capitalism is polemic. But if I say non-authoritarian, non-capitalist, that means I've went to my traditions culturally, spiritually, and I've extracted concepts and practices that are non-capitalist and are non-authoritarian that help form the foundation of an alternative Islamic economy, a foundation to a non-authoritarian Islam that will never feed into a world of the above. This is how, again, Muslims just misunderstand a lot of things. Oh, let's establish an Islamic state. Oh, let's establish a caliphate. Caliphate is not a political, it did not exist during the time of the Prophet. The Prophet founded an Ummah. The caliphate is a prophetic model that forms after the Prophet's death and actually after the Khulafa ar-Rashidin died. Umar wasn't just Umar on his own. Ali wasn't just Ali on his own. Abu Bakr wasn't just Abu Bakr on his own. Uthman were. This is why 3 of the 4 leaders were assassinated too. Because they weren't sitting down in palaces. They didn't go around with bodyguards defending them. They didn't establish a hierarchical order. They were in each other's counsel. And you know what? If they wronged, the Ummah was there to correct them. So this is how Aisha could meet Ali on the battlefield and challenge him in the Battle of the Camel. Because power was fluid and every Muslim was engaged in jihad. And their loyalty wasn't to Ali and loyalty wasn't to Aisha or Abu Bakr. Loyalty was to principles defined by Allah and the Quran.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. You also write in your book, anarchism must be spiritualized and Islam must be destatized. How is this vision reconciled with movements such as, Palestinian solidarity movement or otherwise different movements that are taking place where the demand for statehood remains central to national liberation?
Well, that's not sure. First of all, it's a brilliant question. The encampments were an example of that because there were no leaders in the encampments. Muhammad Khalid was not a leader. Mahmoud was somebody who relayed messages between those in the encampments and Columbia University. That's it. He was a messenger. I'm not meaning to make light of that, but the encampments weren't made for leadership. You have many examples of Muslim anarchists in the Bay Area, in other places across the U.S. The question isn't that. The question is, how do we become a living embodiment of what was built in Gaza, right? Because what is built in Gaza is organic. Communities taking part and families taking part of one another. There is who's the leader right now? There is no leader right now. And it doesn't matter, and it makes it easy because in a certain sense, Sinwar, the general is gone, may he rest in power. Al-Dayf is gone, may he rest in power. Muhammad Sinwar is that he rests in power. The idea is impossible to kill. You can kill, but when you have 1,000 seeds, it becomes much more difficult to decapitate because you're the inverted root of a tree. You have no center. You're a rhizome. You can't be killed because the idea just keeps on growing and spreading sideways and so on. And this is how Hamas could be able to re-recruit the same number of mujahideen, 10,000 mujahideen that were martyred since its operations of October, maybe even more. So this is the strength. And of course, look, there's always going to be differences in power. I can't sit down and say that as somebody who's joining Hamas today, that there isn't and as a mujahid today, that I would be different than Abu Ubaidah. Of course, there's a difference there, Abu Ubaidah. But Abu Ubaidah is seasoned as a speaker for Hamas. He's seasoned in terms of his jihad. When we sit together, we're eating the same food. We're caring for one another. We're in the same tunnels. So there's always going to be, and we need to also understand that, of course, there has to be a little bit of, I don't want to say hierarchies, because they're not institutionalized hierarchies, but differences in power within militant movements, because some people have more experience than others. But as a leader, you share that power. As a leader, you engage in shura, you engage in mutual consultation. And you don't think of yourself as any or more or better or different than other mujahideen. Again, Sinwar was on the ground. He wasn't surrounded. He had 2 other mujahideen with him who were also assassinated. He wasn't walking around with bodyguards. The same thing with Commander Al-Dayf, who was assassinated in Khan Yunis, a refugee camp where he was born. So this is the kind of, again, selflessness of modesty, and this was a general commander. He's not hiding. He's not surrounded by bodyguards. So I think the element of going back to movements, of people understanding, especially on Turtle Island, the importance of spirituality, the importance of secrecy, the importance of organizing, of going underground, of building. It took How it took 10 years for the Zapatistas to build what they built in La Condana jungle. 10 years. And then they appeared at the scene. The Panthers, the same. They didn't just pick up arms. No, they built alternatives. Because then you even have more of a capacity for people to be attracted to your idea, because you're giving them an alternative way of living, an alternative way of seeing the world, right? Picking up arms is actually easy.
I think this relates to something you wrote in the Communique number 3, which describes tunnels as classrooms, clinics, prayer halls, sanctuaries of life beneath the rubble of death. Can you elaborate on these as more than, say, a military infrastructure and what they teach us?
Well, can we imagine? I mean, there are 600 kilometers of subterranean tunnels underground, and the Zionist entity expected that the Mujahideen, if and should they attack, they will attack from above ground. But the Mujahideen had been building these tunnels, some of which go back to the 80s, right?
Mhm.
And sharing their experiences amongst one another. Hezbollah sharing its experiences with Ansarullah, with the Mujahideen. And again, somebody like Qasem Soleimani was instrumental to all this tunnel build. And they weren't building the tunnels with, big caterpillar bulldozers. They were digging them with rudimentary material, with their own hands, with shovels. And in a way, again, if we've been disconnected from land, what better way than to get to know the land that way? 200,000 cement pieces used to form these tunnels, right? And they're spaces of sanctuary where our birds of prey, where the Mujahideen who flew over the wall vis-a-vis the parachute gliders, which was a miraculous story within itself, as you know, that I wrote about at Communique number 3, right? This was all organized through the tunnels. You have to build a place of sanctuary. But again, it's in relationship to land, and our Mujahideen got to know land. They had, again, classrooms there, as you know, they have access to things. They produce their own weapons. There are tourniquets. They don't buy tourniquets from China and America for $50. They learned how to make them for $2, $3 with their own hands. They got samples, and they're just like, okay, how can we make tourniquets like this to stop Mujahideen from bleeding or dying from bleeding when they got injured in the battlefields? So it's a world of alternatives. It's a universe. And only they know it. These 600 kilometers, and they built another 600 kilometers since the Al-Aqsa flood. So they haven't stopped building. They built even more tunnels. This is subhanAllah, like, look at the strength, look at the faith in the midst of war, that you're still able to build tunnels. And they have no center. You can enter from one point, exit from a zillion different points. Nobody has a roadmap to them, etc. And that's okay. Nobody has the full blueprint, save for a few. But yeah, you're able to manufacture your own weapons, down to the bullets, your drones, your whole snipers, like your bombs, absolutely everything. So this is part of, again, the magnanimity that what our Mujahideen built. If only we can build something, instead of us taking to the streets, let's galvanize our resources. Let's go buy a piece of land, rematriate it to indigenous people in the context of Turtle Island. Let's learn how to farm. It's so easy to say, down with capitalism, it's all falling. Okay, when it collapses, who's it going to collapse on? On all of us. It's just like, okay, you hate on capitalism, but do you know how to grow your own food to feed yourself, let alone your family, let alone your community? Then what are you so euphoric about? Because when it collapses, but if I learn to grow my own food and can support my community, I don't need to shop at Wegmans or go to the supermarket to buy my fruits and vegetables anymore. I've divested from the state. When I no longer vote, I've divested. Why aren't we doing more of that? But as the Quran says, وَكَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةٍ كَثِيرَةٍ. Only a small group. This is the problem with mass mobilizations and the fantasy that big movements are going to change the world. They're not. They don't often do. Tahrir didn't. The civil rights didn't. Movement. They don't. They never do. It's people with a vision, an alternative way of life. And our Mujahideen offer us a blueprint.
Well, that's a very important and radical point that you're making, and I kind of appreciate the way you're pulling on different traditions of understanding and that ontological question of ways of living, right, and ways of being. You suggest that to be Muslim and anarchist is to refuse binaries. How is contradiction navigated? How is this contradiction navigated? And has the current war transform that relationship?
I think the most fundamental way is the way that, and I mean, I've been ostracized within anarchist communities for being Muslim and vice versa from Muslim communities because I identify as anarchistic. Anarchism to me reminds me of what Islam should be. And I think there are a lot of dimensions that Islam and Muslims can teach anarchists or leftist movements in generally too. But like I said, this is a political theological project, and one that needs to be anchored in a particular framing. And humility. A Taghūti mentality is coming about, or an anarchist, and it's understandable. Right? A lot of anarchists, particularly in America, who are white, they come from Orthodox Christian backgrounds, generally speaking. They've been exposed to hierarchical understandings of religion, repressive understandings, institutionalized understandings, sexist, misogynist, all kinds of understandings of religion, just as much as Muslims in predominantly Muslim societies are exposed to hierarchical interpretations of Islam, be it at Al-Azhar University or the state kind of Islam. Being able to re-envision Islam in a different way, or any tradition in a different way, including for the white anarchist, becomes something that's very vital and important, right? And hence breaking out of the no gods, no masters kind of logic. A funny story I often tell in 2011, because religious anarchisms we have several books on religious anarchisms that emerged really 2011 onwards, 2010, 2011. But I remember being at an anarchist conference, anarchist studies network conference in Loughborough in 2011. And during the conference, I was giving a talk on Islam and anarchism, and I'm not going to say his name. Then this anarchist comes in. He's also an academic, or he is an academic, and he comes, and after my talk, he's like, I want to ask you a question. I was like, sure, go ahead. He's a classical anarchist, right? And of course, there are many interpretations of anarchism, just as much as there are many interpretations of Islam. But anyways, he comes to me and he says, so last week, we made effigies of the Prophet Muhammad, of Moses, of Jesus, and we burnt them. I just want to know what your thoughts are. I was like, well, here I am trying to bridge the proximity between, our disparate communities, and you come and tell me you made an image of, I don't, first of all, I don't know what my prophet looks like because we have no illustration of that. But sure, do what you may, but I want to ask you a question. Like, I'm trying to bridge the proximities here, and you're trying to break them. You're trying to break the bridges. But if I was to say to you, I made effigies of Emma Goldman, Bakun, and Kropotkin, how would that make you feel? He's like, well, you can't do that. These are our gods. I was like, well, so much for no gods, no masters. So look, this is what I mean by the Taghūt, that you construct a god, you construct prophets as God. And of course, I would never do that to Emma Bakun and Kropotkin, and I do have critiques of them. And again, this is where self-critique becomes important. A lot of them were Jewish anarchists, and they didn't really contend with the element of spirituality. But we grow or evolve. This is, the beauty about Malcolm is his endless metamorphosis, right? And any revolutionary has to be that way. You have to grow, and you have to grow in an interdisciplinary way. How do I connect with indigenous struggles? How do I connect with Maya traditions? How do I connect? Like, one of the things that I learned is very early on when I moved to Turtle Island is smudging, right? And in Islam, you have tayammum. Well, when you don't have water to perform ablution, you just take some dirt, as you know, and you rub it across your hands and then your face, and you're a state of purity, and you can pray. Well, smudging is more or less the same thing, right? It's meant to, you're burning some sage, and it's this entering into a spiritual realm, a cleansiness realm, and so on. So it's the extrapolations and establishing booms between our various different traditions that become very important here, right? As opposed to embracing ourselves in closed boxes and closed identities and dogmatism and hegemonic vanguardist ways that really embody, again, a Taghūti, a Daeshi, a fundamentalist perspective. So I think, there's a lot that we can learn from one another. And again, we created you from different tribes and nations who make it to know one another.
Yeah, I think that especially anarchism in the US, like, it emerged under certain conditions, related to like deindustrialization and those sort of things. Like, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think a lot of these spaces can be exclusionary, while there are also a lot of interesting questions that they're answering in terms of the broader radical movement and those things. And the spaces can be exclusionary, but I also do see a greater openness to various forms of spirituality, in different ways.
More than Marxism, I have to give it to anarchists, I have to give it to anarchists. It's much more than within Marxist spaces.
Yeah, I think like democratic socialist or left spaces over there's a great infatuation with the state, right? And saving capitalism somehow, which I think is counterproductive as well. But I think that's kind of what we've seen because of the centrality of Palestinian solidarity, the role of MSAs and SJPs. I think like the growing coalition between them and like various like like radical Black Marxists, anarchists, slash, other groups. I think that has been a key. They've been very crucial in sort of decentering the larger hegemony of these groups that they had in the 90s and early 2000s and onwards. But obviously, I totally agree with what you're talking about there. In your book and in the Al Jazeera piece, you offer a critique of Muslim immigrants in North America for their complicity in settler colonial structures. This is something you mentioned earlier in the interview. What would a genuine decolonial Islamic solidarity look like across North America, Palestine, and beyond?
Thank you. Well, the embodiment of an Islam that is genuinely abolitionist, that contends with, as I noted earlier, anti-Blackness, anti-indigenous politics, queerphobia, sexism, ageism, classism. In Turtle Island, relations with land. Look, even indigenous people have been displaced from land. We all need to relearn our relationships to land. There is no going back to 1492. So we need to get to know land in various different ways and geographies. As I noted earlier, there is a potential for an urban zapatismo through guerrilla gardening or other tactics. But the irony about living in the US or Canada is most people of color live in the urban metropolis, right? So we've bought into civilizational modality, the high-rise buildings, the architectures, the jobs, university or otherwise. But who controls the land along the Rice Belt I-4 corridor, let alone in middle America, so to speak? It's the white farmers who are armed to the teeth with stamp decrees, and they're the ones that feed the urban metropolis. So they can end us all if they wanted to, be it vis-a-vis food access or access to food, or through physical violence. We need to rebuild our relationships with land, and we need to center indigenous people, as I noted earlier, at the very heart of the struggle. We need to go back to 1492. But this also needs to be embodied over here. For instance, insofar as Nubian people, they've been displaced 3-4 times, twice during the time of Nasser, I believe, once during Sadat and Mubarak's era as well. So if we're talking about tunnels, if we're talking about rebuilding our relationships, that means you're talking about 80% of Egypt is just desert. We need to move, and we need to start leaving the urban metropolis and building on farms and building relationships with people on the land, indigenous people, Siwa, for instance, Bedouin Arab tribes, and so on and so forth, right? The way that the Rafah border used to embody that kind of anarchistic sort of fluidity where the state didn't have control, Zionists didn't have control, but it was, these anarchistic sort of Bedouin communes, if you will, 100 people living in townships. I mean, they still exist, say, on the border of Egypt and Sudan at this moment, right? But exploiting that even further and building more of those and tying those together like a spider's web, like a network, right? You produce something that I have, like mangoes, I need apples. Okay, let's exchange in mutual aid and engagement. And what are you building your commune on? What am I building? But again, this can only be translated face to face. It can't manifest in the virtual sphere. It's not enough to simply say, oh, indigenous and Black and Palestinian people, it's the same struggle. It's all one. What is the narrative, and how do we embody that in our day-to-day lives? That's, again, the practical question. But you still have to come up with the interpretation of the Quran that is decolonial, that is abolition. Everybody needs to go back to their tradition and develop from their perspective, in Islam or Christianity and Judaism or whatever of the below, because any community is capable of rising to the above. Look at Maya civilizations, right? When the Aztec rose and became oppressive in a certain sense, they oppressed other indigenous people and communities and so on. So any civilization, any people, any spiritual compass can be easily contorted. That's not the fault of this spirituality or the religion or the faith within itself. It's the fault of the people that are doing the misinterpreting and misunderstanding. But I think, maybe everybody getting off Twitter and Facebook and gathering and pooling their wealth together, or whatever, $100 from here, $100 from there, instead of all that money going to bailing kids that are, again, I'm not against taking over Grand Central Station, but how many people need to be arrested? How many times do you have to repeat the same time? That's a tactic. That's not a strategy. So why don't you pool all that money, those resources, buy a piece of land, put it in a land trust, and start building with indigenous people wherever you are, be it on Lenape territory or otherwise. That would be, Loni people, if you're in the case of, San Francisco, it's that kind of dedication, right? And growing food is not easy, but dirt cleans off a lot easier than city smog and blood and and so on. So, but yeah, and living together is not, again, easy either. It's very challenging because if you imagine a couple, they will disagree on the height or like household chores, or unwashed dishes. Can you imagine what it takes to establish a community, right? If just a couple disagree and they few years, or they leave each other apart in a few years because they have these kinds of disagreements. Living with people is not easy, but it
Yeah.
requires transparency, openness, humility, and a desire to grow and to learn and to contend the monsters that exist within us. This is what's critical.
You discuss about habitual solidarity, which is rooted in usul al-daf'iyyah and usul al-ikhtilāf. What do these principles offer to contemporary leftists and spiritual movements seeking unity without flattening difference?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, or and just now, if we are to get to know one another, then the ethics of hospitality, disagreements, as opposed to Marxist tearing anarchists apart and anarchists tearing Marxists and everybody tearing feminists and everybody tearing spiritual people.
Internal parties.
Exactly, right? It's a one-upping of one another. And disagreements, as I've written, tend to happen for 4 different reasons, maybe more, right? One of them is ego. One of them is a lack of knowledge, lack of experience, a desire to triumph over another person with a different idea. And there are ways to deal with that, right? But because there is an ethics to disagree, whereby we can find middle solutions, whether something is a strategy or tactic, matters a lot. People tend to conflate strategies with tactic. They're not one and the same thing. A tactic is parachute gliders. A strategy is October 7th in its totality, and all the studies that entails, including surveilling sort of the enemy and everything, down to the surveillance cameras, let alone the height of the sidewalk or the siege barrier and how you're going to break through it. Right. And something that evolves over time as well. So one has to have mediators in order to prevent shikak, because disagreements doesn't have to lead to us splintering apart. But the problem is that we don't have a consensus of what we're fighting against or what we're fighting for. If you tell me we're fighting against capitalism and imperialism and colonialism and we're on turtle line, I was like, okay, well, what about settler-colonialism? Are we fighting about that against that too? Are we fighting against the state too? Or is this just because that will make an influence. If you believe that you can just take over the United States, then sorry, we can have tactical alliances, but we're not on the same strategic page because we're actually starting from different starting points. You see that it's possible to engage in some revolution through the state. I don't believe that that's possible at all. I think that that's a pipe dream fantasy, right? So, and usul al-daf'iyyah becomes central then because we need to get to know one another across the prejudices that we've internalized. Oh, so that's what I mean. There are rituals of hospitality, right? In Islam, when you have a guest, you honor them for 3 days and a night. You don't even ask them what their name is because they could be escaping persecution. As Derrida would say, the name is to be offered unconditionally, without reservation, without fear. And even asking somebody's name could be a violent act. Right. But you treat them or they are treated as if that's their home. The guest becomes the host. You give them the best of what you have. You give them your room. You give them, you don't just get them to stay on a couch. You offer them everything. So there's an ethics, and it varies according to cultures in terms of hospitality. Tupinamba tribal ceremonies, when a stranger comes to Tupinamba people, they cry because a guest is a guest from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're a guest from creation. They're a guest from the universe. And it's a miracle getting to know somebody's name, let alone taking responsibility for that name. I may die today, tomorrow, in a moment, an hour from now. And then it's left for you to bear responsibility for knowing my name. And all we leave behind, according to Islam, are 3 things. Knowledge that benefits future generations, children that remember us alongside with family, community, or a hospital, school, a tree that we planted that a poor person rests underneath in the blazing sun on a hot day, let alone eats from the dates, if that is a palm tree. So that's all that we leave behind. We don't take our books, we don't take our accolades, we don't take our certificates or degrees or our PhDs. We leave everything. Right. So again, back to that moment of humility. If we're getting to know one another, we need to invest in knowing each other's traditions, especially in this time. right now, and probably like 3-4 weeks ago, Ted Cruz put out I believe they're going to be discussing it in Congress or the Senate, the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, in Trump's last term in office, his first trip was also, as you probably remember, was to Saudi Arabia. And it was, I believe, in 2016. And he also got billions of dollars then, I think $500 billion, as a matter of fact. And Sisi was there, and it was this dystopian moment. And the request that Arabs had of him, particularly the Gulf Arabs, was, we want you to destroy the Muslim Brotherhood. We've destroyed them over here because, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood were removed in the context of Egypt and so on and so forth. But we want you to destroy them over there. What they meant by that is every single Muslim student association. They meant CARE, the Council for American Islamic Relations, ISNA, Islamic North Society of North America, all that have also bought into a world of the above, because they buy into a hyphenated American, unapologetic Muslim American identity. There are lots of those folks, right? And they're all founded on Muslim Brotherhood thought. Now, Muslim Brotherhood thought varies, and one MSA may be different than the other. One could be relatively liberal progressive, the other one more radical, the other one conservative, absolutely. But it is destroying any manifestation of so-called political Islam, any leftist potential alliance too between these two factions. And Palestine is a perfect anchor for these two to come together, for this confluence of power to come together. But yeah, there's a lot of work to do, as we've clearly noted. In the meanwhile, to overcome these things, and ethics of disagreement and hospitality are fundamental.
So I want to conclude. I know that you've been through a lot over the last year or two. And what are your plans in terms of your work and just moving forward? What are you exploring intellectually? How are you grounding yourself spiritually and politically? And what has been your approach to dealing with what you've been through?
Thank you. God bless you. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, like I said, it's not even what one gave, it's the right thing to do. And it's not even a sacrifice. It's an iota of what one should be doing in this great moment. Right now, of course, as you noted, I have the Substack, and I'm really enjoying the fact that I'm able to write freely there without having to have any gatekeeping whatsoever. I mean, there's always going to be gatekeeping, whether people circulate things or not. That's a different one. That's always part of the gatekeeping. But in terms of editors or publishing something with the various different platforms that exist there, right? So I'm free to write and say what I do. I'm unshackled from academia. I'm inshallah planning on teaching courses online. They're part of me and what a community of dearest friends are going to be referring to as the Resistance Academy. I've already planned out 5 or 6 courses. One course is on 1492. Another one will be 1492, Palestine and Turtle Island, and everything that we've been discussing and that I work on. Another one will be on gender and sexuality, connecting queer and feminist, indigenous, Black, Muslim traditions, people of color traditions with one another. A third course is on social movement histories. I think there is a huge gap between my generation and Generation Z in terms of understanding the decade of Seattle 1999 up until Tahrir and what has been built, the arc then, sadly, which I think has influenced a lot of the limitations in terms of horizons, because I think most people don't actually know social movement theories nor histories, especially that decade. That was really crucial, because that decade, a lot of movements took an anarchistic turn. And I'm seeing a return back to Lenin and Stalin, and which is really quite sad and ironic, as if these characters and figures were highly problematic, right? And that history isn't fraught. But another course I'll be teaching is on the Maqam. What are the weapons that Hamas or that Al-Qassam versus Ansarullah are using? How did they create them? So really a study of the art of war, the guerrilla warfare, and counterinsurgency manuals, which is very important, because we are, like I said,
this is all very necessary work.
So yeah, there's that. It's going to be a part of the Resistance Academy. I didn't share this publicly yet, so this would be a first for you. I actually just finished a children's book called Heroes of the Ummah, because I believe this new generation needs to learn about the general Daif, Nasrallah, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. Yeah, and there's side characters within it. So inshallah, I think we'll have to independently publish it, but that's okay. But yeah, hopefully people will appreciate it, and particularly our children.
Yeah.
With October, but don't have an understanding of what happened. Children in Palestine, infants that have been murdered while they were 0 years old, while they're still unborn and still within their mother's wombs. So yeah, I'm really grateful for, opportunities like
This is
you, for opportunity friends that I have, that you've been keeping me in Ramadan was such a blessing to go through that. So my next piece is on Muhammad al-Dayf, inshallah. Hopefully it'll be published soon. So yeah, it's been just trying to keep it very rich, and I do miss organizing on the ground, and I'm still trying to figure that out given the context of Egypt, which is very difficult.
Yeah, this is really inspiring because the space for critical and radical, has been suffocated a lot, over a period of time. And I think, what you're doing is at the cutting edge, creating platforms which are independent and which allow you to do your work. And I think, for me, that is what's really inspiring. It's, sending you lots of love and solidarity and salams. Inshallah. Again, thank you, Dr. Abdou, for this radical, deeply grounded conversation. From the tunnels of Gaza to the pages of your books, you've shown that resistance is not tactical. It is not only tactical, it is strategic, theological, ethical, and intimate. To our listeners, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Support our work at buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network, and stay tuned for more conversations at the intersections of faith, struggle, and refusal. Thank you again.
Thank you, Shirley, and thank you to the audience. And God bless you for the work that you do. It's very admirable, and I'm very grateful for this
Thank you.
opportunity again.